You should have your sheets that say the patriarchal age at the top. I also wanted you to know, while everybody's going to classes, I did put the new sheets out there. There's a stack of new sheets out there, which will be the lesson to follow this one. We'll be moving from this into the Mosaic age. It has 3 sheets to it. There's a little bit more time periods on it, but that will be the next one after we finish this. Hopefully we'll finish this one up tonight. If not, we'll finish it next week and then move on, but the new sheets are out there. Last time we met, which was, I don't know, it seems like 2 weeks ago maybe, because of the gospel meeting, and I think we had a singing in between. So 2 weeks ago, whenever it was, we got down to the Tower of Babel, and where God confused the language. Genesis 10 and 11 is basically the spreading of humanity over the earth. And of course, chapter 11 is that little story where they resisted spreading over all the earth. That's why God confused their languages. They were going to stay right there. They weren't going to fill the earth as they were told. And God said, no, you are going to fill the earth. So he confused their languages, so they had to stop their skyscraper project. And they had to move over to the rest of the earth. Starting in chapter 12, that brings us to where we left off last time. In chapter 12, we have, I call this the foundational promise of the Bible. The Abrahamic promises, because really the rest of the Bible is the unfolding of this very story that we're going to read about here in the first 3 verses. God called Abraham out of Ur of the Chaldees, which was his home, his original land. That land, by the way, is kind of over there where Iran and Iraq is now. A lot of these stories take place in that area. And so, you know, if you're ever wondering where some of these places are, a lot of them right there in that little Fertile Crescent area right in there, and that's exactly where this is. And he calls Abraham out to the promised land. Verses 1, 2, and 3. The Lord had said to Abram, "Get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and curse him who curses you, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." 3 promises made. And we talk about this a lot because it's very important. It's really the basis of the rest of the Bible story. The first promise, verse 12, a land. What land is that? That's the land of Canaan. The second promise, the national promise. Verse 2, I will make you a great nation. What nation is that?
Israel.
That's Israel. And we were talking about that in our Romans study on Sunday, about God chose Isaac instead of Ishmael, and then God chose Jacob instead of Esau, and he was building his special people, this nation. He was building this nation. And we talked about the Ishmaelites, which are the Arabs. And to this day, the Jews and the Arabs fight over that land. That very land we're reading about right here. Because the Muslims claim that land as theirs. They claim it through Ishmael, and the Jews claim it through Isaac. And so we still have that problem. Now, God's moved on. I said that Sunday when we were talking about this. God's moved on, and that's what I wanted to talk about here. The third promise, and I'll show you why God moved on. The third promise, in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. That's what we call the seed promise. I'll tell you why it's called the seed promise in just a second. No mention of a seed here just yet. But if you move on out to chapter 22, I believe it is. Yeah, 22 and verse 18, God renews the promise to Abraham. And in fact, verse 17, for a little context, blessing, I will bless you. Multiplying, I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven. There's that nation again. God's building that nation. As the sand which is on the seashore, your descendants shall possess the gate of their enemies. And in your seed, there's the word right there. In your seed, all of the nations of the earth shall be blessed because you've obeyed my voice. That's the same promise of Genesis 12:3, but it doesn't say seed in Genesis 12. It just says in you. It's the same, means the same thing, but it becomes more clear in that word seed. Who is that seed? Okay, that's clearly Christ. Galatians 3:16 confirms that, in case there's any doubt. Paul makes that very clear in Galatians 3:16. Now, the first 2 promises, the land and the nation, are stepping stones to the third promise. Okay? And so God put them in a land and built a nation to dwell in that land, and from that nation would come the Messiah. And so the first 2 promises are stepping stones to the third. The third promise is the main promise. The Christ, the salvation, the hope of heaven, all of that, that's for all nations. It has nothing to do with the Jews or any other race. It has to do with everybody. And so the first two were stepping stones, and the reason that's important to know is because once the stepping stones have been stepped on and we get to the third one, the first two aren't necessary anymore. And so when you think about modern times and the Arab-Israeli conflict, that has absolutely nothing to do with the Bible. God's done with that. He's moved on. All that is today is politics. Now you can take whatever political view you want. You know, the United States tends to side with Israel, and there's probably good reasons for that. But know this, it has nothing to do with the Bible. It's strictly political. That doesn't mean there isn't a right answer. It doesn't mean that our position is wrong on that in terms of the government. It just means understand has nothing to do with the Bible. They can fight over that land from now until Jesus returns. God's moved on. He's moved on from that. That's got nothing to do with the Bible. Any questions on that, by the way?
I agree with you, but there is religious people and different political people that still have a strong view that Israel is to be protected, the land is to be protected because of the premillennial ideas and all. That is behind a lot of ideas.
Yeah, and that influences our politics to some extent. It really does. That whole premillennial notion that Jesus is going to come back and rule and reign in Israel on the throne of David in Jerusalem on the earth for 1,000 years. That's premillennialism. The Bible doesn't teach it. But that's premillennialism, and that is back of a lot of our politics on this, because there are people who believe in that and appeal to that in their political decisions. And again, I'm not putting down Israel. That's a political thing. It doesn't really matter to me. But I'm saying to you, it really has nothing to do with the Bible. But they want to make it about the Bible. People today want to make it about the Bible.
It's Jews throughout the world that promote that, though, and that's where the politics comes in.
Yeah. It's the money and the politics and the power and all of that. It all comes into play. But whatever happens over in the Middle East really has nothing to do with the Bible. And people will say, well, prophecies are coming to pass. And they appeal to the Old Testament prophecies where Israel was going to be restored to their land. Now, for the premillennialists that you were talking about, the key date for them was 1947. Anybody know what happened in 1947? They reestablished the state of Israel. Oh, prophecy's coming to pass. And what they missed is, no. That was fulfilled hundreds and hundreds of years before that when Israel went back to their land. They were already restored to their land when Jesus came. They were already restored to their land when Jesus came. They came back from Babylonian captivity. 1947 has nothing to do with the Bible at all. And modern day Israel has nothing to do with the Bible at all. But it's good to know that because these things come up in discussion sometimes. But he's going to build this nation. He's going to bless all men through Christ Jesus. And the rest of the Bible is the unfolding of that story. That's why this is a foundational promise. In fact, there's 3 promises made here. And sometimes in the New Testament, they're just called the promises. And sometimes it's called the promise. And when it's talking about the promise, it's talking about that seed promise of Christ. For example, in Acts 2, when Peter said, repent and be baptized, every one of you, in verse 39, he said, the promise is to you and to your children and to all who are, he's talking about this promise right here, this Abrahamic promise. It's to you and to your children and to all who are afar off, as many as the Lord our God shall call. He's talking about that Abrahamic promise. And so it's so ingrained in the Jewish psyche that they just called it the promise. Whenever anybody talked about the promise, they knew they were talking about the Abrahamic promise. And that's how critical Genesis 12 is. And again, as I said all along, these early chapters of Genesis set the stage for the rest of the Bible. You know, you've got the origin of mankind, the origin of sin, the origin of marriage, the origin of redemption. You got the origin of the Jewish nation. You got all these origin stories right here in Genesis that are so critical to the rest of the Bible. Key figures here, of course, you got Abraham. He's the father of the Jewish people. I used the term, I think last time we had class, and this is a countrified expression, but God used Abraham as breed stock. That's basically what he did. Instead of picking a nation that was already in existence and saying, you're going to be my chosen nation, God built a nation from Abraham. Remember, Abraham couldn't have any kids. Sarah couldn't have any kids. She was barren. God said, you're going to have kids. And he built a nation of his own. Instead of picking one of the nations that were already on the earth, he built a nation of his own. So he used Abraham as breed stock here to build this nation through whom Jesus would come. From Abraham came Isaac. He was in the chosen lineage. Remember, there was Ishmael and Isaac. And Isaac was chosen. Then you had Jacob and Esau, and God chose Jacob. And right on down, and Jacob's name was changed to Israel, who had 12 sons, the 12 sons of Israel, who became the 12 tribes of Israel, which is what the nation of Israel is made of. So Genesis is really telling that story of the development of that nation. At the end of Genesis, Genesis 37 to 50, those chapters, that's the longest story in Genesis, the story of Joseph. And he's one of those 12 sons. And there's a great story in that without going into great detail. Again, this whole study is not about getting into all the details. It's a top water looking over the whole Bible from one end to the other. So we can't go into lots and lots of detail. But this story of Joseph is a great story in the providence of God. I'm a strong believer in God's providence. I believe God is at work in our lives. He cares enough to be involved in our lives, and He's at work in our lives. If that's not true, then why bother to pray? I mean, the whole point of prayer is to get this ruler of the universe to pay attention to me. I have a request. I need this or I need that. If it be your will, please give it to me. And so that whole notion of prayer is rooted in the providence of God. Does God answer prayer or not? I believe He does. And so that demands He be involved in our lives. And I believe He's involved in our lives a lot more than we realize sometimes. Putting us in certain situations, bringing certain people into our lives that cross our paths. And you see this beautifully played out with Joseph. Joseph he was favored by his parents, and this is a mistake. Parents don't do what Joseph's parents did, but they showed favoritism to him. What did that do to his brothers? Tell us, they hated him. They hated his guts. Mom and Dad favored him. And of course, the great image of that favoritism was vividly in that coat of many colors that Joseph was given. And so they hate his guts. They want to get rid of him. The first plan, let's kill him. And I think it's Reuben who said, no, we don't really want to do that. So what did they end up doing with him?
Slavery.
Sold him into slavery. Can you imagine that, selling your own brother into slavery? That's what they did. And then they wasn't done. They took his garments and they dipped it in blood and brought him to his dad, knowing that he would draw the conclusion that some wild animals tore him up. So his brothers were involved in a great deception. Not only did they sell him into slavery, but then they let their dad believe. In fact, they didn't just let him believe, they led him to believe. They didn't just come out and say it, but here's his bloody garments. And so he puts two and two together. Well, that must mean Joseph was torn by some wild beast. So for like 20 years, he thinks his son is dead, and they let him believe it. They let him believe it. So Joseph goes down there, he's enslaved in Egypt, and he gets a little bit of reputation, and he winds up in Potiphar's house, but then his wife comes in, tries to seduce him. This is in Genesis 39, I think. Lie with me. Every day. Let's go take a look at that real quick. Genesis 30, I don't know if it's 37 or 39, I'll tell you in a second. 39, yeah. But it says, verse 1, Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, brought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. So this is the slavery results in Joseph winding up in Potiphar's house. The Lord was with Joseph. There's the providence of God. Okay? You think the Lord ain't with him because his brothers hated him, his brothers sold him. You think the Lord ain't with him. The Lord's with him. Okay? This is all part of God's plan. And he was a successful man. He was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. His master saw that the Lord was with him, that the Lord made all he did to prosper. So Joseph found favor in his sight and served him. And he made him overseer of his house, and all that he had he put under his authority. So when you're a steward like that, you're in charge of the guy's checkbook. It'd be like you being in charge of Donald Trump's checkbook. That's what Joseph was. Okay, he's in charge of this guy's checkbook. He's in charge. He's his steward. He's in charge of everything that he's got. That's a trusted position. You know, Jared talked about that with the Ethiopian eunuch. That's a trusted position. You know, here, take the checkbook, pay my bills. I trust you to keep track of my money. I don't know if I'm that trusting of anybody. I'll keep mine in my own pocket. but you know, wealthy people, they do that because they've got so many other things going on, so they hire somebody else to take care of their money. Okay? So anyway, this is the position Joseph's in. Well, Joseph's wife, or not Joseph's wife, Potiphar's wife decides she wants him. And in verse 6, thus he had left all that he had in Joseph's hand. He did not know what he had except for the bread which he ate. So this is how much Joseph is trusted. I don't even know how much money I got. Joseph's in charge of that. I don't even know how much is in there. Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. Now this is a statement by God about Joseph. Understand what's being said here. Handsome in form. That means he's shaped like a man. He's broad at the shoulders and narrow at the hip. He's a good-looking dude. Okay, that's what this is saying. That's what this is saying about Joseph. And in appearance, handsome face. So Joseph is a good-looking dude. So it came to pass after these things, his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph. She said, lie with me. Well, that's tempting enough. But then she does it every day. Every day. Verse 10. So it was, she spoke to Joseph day by day, that he did not heed her to lie with her, to be with her. Now, I'm going to tell you something. Just be honest. That'll wear on a man after a while. It's one thing to turn it down once, okay? But she comes at you again and again and again and again. That'll wear on a man. And Joseph, one day, he's backed into a corner. And she grabs him by the garment. Lie with me. And Joseph only had one move left. What did he do? Ran. Sometimes there's nothing disgraceful about a retreat. Sometimes you just got to run away. Because if he'd have hung around there, he'd have done something he'd have regretted. He'd have done something wrong. Let's be honest about it. He would have committed adultery with her. So he said, I got to go. He ran. So this speaks very well of Joseph and his character, that he turned this down over and over and over and over again. Well, then she turns the tables on him, and she accuses him. He came into me. He tried to get me. And so she turned the tables on him. You know, a few years back, we had that Me Too movement. You remember that? A couple, 3, 4, 5 years back? Had a Me Too movement, and there's a big little phrase going around. Believe all women. Nonsense. Nonsense. Accusers sometimes lie. Potiphar's wife lied. She falsely accused. She was the one who was making the advances, and she accused him of doing it. Okay? So you look at from the outside, look at remember it said the Lord was with Joseph? From the outside, if you're a worldly person, you say, the Lord ain't with him. His brothers hate him. His brothers wanted to kill him. They sold him into slavery. He's been accused of rape. He's in jail. The Lord ain't with him, but he was. Now, plug that into your life. Sometimes all these bad things happen, but what does the Bible say? God can make all things work together for good. Do you believe it or not? Do you believe it or not? Good can come from it. Good can come from bad things if we trust in God. If we're loyal. Remember, that was the key with Joseph. He was faithful to God. He didn't give in to her advances. He didn't give in to hatred of his brothers. He maintained his integrity with God through his whole life, and he was blessed for it. In God's providence, all this stuff happened for a reason. What was it?
Take care of
Save
it.
the nation.
Yeah, there was a famine coming, and God was doing some positioning. This is God's providence once again. God's doing some positioning. I allowed Joseph to be sold into slavery. I allowed Joseph to wind up in jail because I knew that in that spot down there, eventually he'd come to the attention of the Pharaoh, and he'd be exalted to a position where he could interpret the Pharaoh's dreams and save all these people from the famine. So this is God's providence, okay? And this story from Genesis 37 to Genesis 50 is a great story of God's providence. There's other stories just like it in the Bible. This is just one of them that stands out. But I really believe that still goes on today. God is involved in your life, and he's involved in my life in ways that we can't possibly imagine sometimes. Sometimes you can look back on it and you can see it. Well, that had to have been the Lord that did that. It had to have been. But sometimes when you're right in the middle of it, all you can see is the trials and the troubles. And you don't know why this is happening or what's going on here, but just trust in God because he knows what he's doing. Let's cut to the chase here out to the end of the book, chapter 50.
We know like where you're going in 50 that Joseph understood it then, but we're not give any indication that he was given any insight
Yeah.
during that.
Right, that's a
He's
great
still
point.
faithful, but we're not, we're not told that God ever got a message to him. Do you just hang on that this is for a reason at all? All this stuff was put on him, and he just kept serving God.
He kept being faithful to God, and that's a lesson for us. We don't always know why this happens, why that happens, and what's going on, but keep trusting God, because whether it's here or whether it's over yonder, you're going to be blessed for being faithful to God. God's going to notice. He's not going to let you down in the end. But in Genesis 50, he has a chance to get back at his brothers for all that they did to him, and he doesn't do that. They're scared to death of him. Because, I've left some things out. The famine came. They've been saving grain at the behest of Joseph, been saving grain for the 7 years of plenty. Now they got grain to sell back to the people during the famine. And here comes Joseph's brothers. They need grain too. And so in the course of all that, Joseph is revealed to be alive to his brothers. He is revealed to be alive to his father. And they all moved down there into Egypt. This is setting the stage up for the bondage, by the way, the Egyptian bondage. They all moved, at this time there's only about 70 of them. So from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and now we got 70 souls that moved down into Egypt. But verse 15, Genesis 50, verse 15, Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead. They said, perhaps Joseph will hate us and may actually repay us for all the evil which we did to him. Well, if you're thinking just as a human, you can kind of understand that. But Joseph is a little bit more spiritually minded than that. So they sent messengers to Joseph saying, before your father died, he commanded us, saying, thus you shall say to Joseph, I beg you, please forgive the trespass of your brothers and their sin, for they did evil to you. Now please forgive the trespass of the servants of the God of your father. And Joseph wept when they spoke to him. This touched him. And it says his brothers went and fell down before his face, and they said, we are your servants. They're groveling before Joseph because they're scared to death. And Joseph said, do not be afraid, for am I in the place of God? I'm not God, and I'm not going to pass sentence on you. Okay? As for you, you meant evil against me. They had their agenda, and their agenda was evil. But God meant it for good. Now look at that. God can take the same evil circumstances that his brothers created and turn it into something good. That's providence. I think that still happens today. That's the whole point of Romans 8:28. All things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose. So he says, you had your agenda. You meant evil. You did a wicked thing to me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive. Now therefore do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones. And he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. In a word, what would you say verse 21 is telling us? There's one word, starts with an F. Forgiveness. There you go. Forgiveness. Forgiveness is easy to say and ain't always easy to do. It means let it go. That's literally what it means. Let it go. Yeah, you meant evil against me. Yeah, you hated my guts, but never mind. We're going to move on from that. I'm not going to hold you responsible. I'm not going to get back at you. This is gone. This is water under the bridge. That's forgiveness. By the way, that's what God does to you when you come to him, when you're baptized, and when you return to him in prayer. He just says, never mind. You did a terrible thing. You said a bad word. Your temper got away from you. You did this, you did. Never mind. I forgive you. And so we have to carry that forward. We have to forgive others. And that's what Joseph did. This is all setting the stage to get the children of Israel down into Egypt. And again, God's providence. Remember, I told you that Genesis 12 is that story of the Bible in a nutshell. Genesis 12, 1, 2, and 3. So now they're all down there in Egypt. And what's going to happen to them?
They're going to go take the promised land one day.
Yeah, but before that, they got to go through some trials too, see? Just like Joseph had to go through some trials, the entire nation has to go through some. They got to go into bondage, into bondage for 400 years. Now, again, as Peter said, with the Lord, one day is as 1,000 years, 1,000 years is one day. That means time doesn't mean anything to God. 400 years, human beings say, that's a long time. Lord, certainly you're more powerful than that.
Building an army all that time.
Yeah, he's building a nation, building an army. He's got his plans, and he works on his timetable, and time doesn't mean anything to God. But for the Jews, 400 years of slavery, that's exactly what happened. But he's going to bring them out. In the process, he's going to judge Egypt for their sins and the Pharaoh for his sins, and he's going to bring the Israelites, he's going to give them that land that he promised Abraham way back in Genesis 12. So see, this is the story unfolding. This is that Abrahamic promise, all unfolding until they go down there into bondage for 400 years. Now, if you look at your chart, you come across here, down the third row across, Jewish focus. We've covered that. That's Genesis 12 to 50. That's the story of Abraham and the development of that Jewish nation. Now we're down here at that second, Jewish bondage. These dates I've got here are approximate dates. I don't know that we have exact dates, and it depends on which scholar you read. Some will date Moses as late as 1200 BC. I'm more inclined to think he's probably more like 1500 BC, but different scholars come up with different dates, and part of the reason for that is it's hard to harmonize the Egyptian chronology with the Jewish chronology. Sometimes they're not clear, and they don't always mesh together, so it's hard to harmonize. We can get approximately, we can get close. It might be helpful if we had names, if we knew exactly who the Pharaoh was when Moses came, and we don't really know. So scholars take a stab at it. Some say it was Ramses, and some say it was another one. And so you've got all these different viewpoints out there. But those dates I have there are approximate dates. So 1900 BC, when they moved down there to Egypt, 1500 BC when they come up out of Egypt. So there's that 400 years of slavery. And then coming out, that brings us down to that last row on your page there. So the Jewish Exodus. What's the word Exodus mean? It means to go out. Yeah, it's kind of like exit. You see the word exit back there, but that's not how you spell exit. Exodus, but it means going out or leaving. Okay, and Peter even used that word to describe his own death. He said, the time of my departure, my exodus, literally in the Greek, the time of my exodus is near. And so that term exodus means departure. And in the book of Exodus, talking about the departure of the children of Israel out of Egypt from their bondage and into the promised land. But look at all the years from Abraham, and Abraham's 2000 BC, up till the time they go to the promised land. That's 500 years before they ever get to the promised land. So those promises in Genesis 12 and I'm talking about the first two stepping stones didn't even come to pass for 500 years in their fullness before they actually got the land. Now they were in the process. The nation was being built. The seed was being developed. The nation was but they didn't get their land for another 400 or 500 years. Think about that. So that takes some faith to wait.
Even get to the promised land.
Yeah. There was that generation there that they grumbled. They had this bad habit. Every time they got in a jam, they'd grumble. Well, we ain't got no food. We ain't got no water. You brought us out here in the desert to kill us. We had the flesh pots back in Egypt, and God had enough of that after a while, and he made them wander in the wilderness for 40 years. And that whole generation died out. And it was the next generation that took them into the promised land with the addition of 2 from the original generation. Who was it? Anybody remember? Joshua and Caleb. They were the only 2 because they were the ones that had the faith that said, we can take this land. The others, again with the grumbling, they're giants in the land. We can't take the land. We can't do it. They're stronger than we are. They're mightier than we are. And Joshua and Caleb said, we can do this. We got this. With the Lord on our side, we got this. So they were allowed to go. The rest of that generation all died out before they were allowed to go into the promised land.
When they got ready to come in, Caleb told them he was still strong and ready to do God. And he was
like 90 years old or something. Yeah, he said, yeah, I'm ready to fight. Let's go. Yeah.
I tell you another thing that always amazed me about Joseph's faith. Joseph told him, you take my bones.
Yeah, take it back to the promise.
He knew that they was going back.
Yeah.
He had faith that they would.
He had faith that they'd go back.
They would return.
And they took him back and buried him there. That's exactly right. So, sometimes we gloss over these stories and we don't realize the depth of stuff that's there. And as I said, we've just done a topwater over the top here of Genesis, just like that in the last 3 or 4 weeks. But the depth of all these stories that are laying the foundation for all the stuff to come in the rest of the Bible. One more thing I wanted to throw in. You look down the right-hand row up and down there, and you'll see there's no Bible books written until you get down there where it says Job. And notice where he's placed. He's placed in the time of Abraham. That's what most scholars believe. Job lived in the time of Abraham, about 2000 BC. Book of Job is the oldest book in the Bible. And if you have a chronological Bible, you've heard me talk about those before, that's where they put the books in there chronologically, in the order that the events actually occurred. Our Bibles aren't laid out that way. They're laid out, we got the law and the prophets and the Psalms and all. Our Bibles are laid out differently. But if you put it in there chronologically, and you had a chronological Bible, the story of the book of Job comes in right about Genesis 12, because that's about the time of Abraham. And they'll just insert the whole book of Job right there. So you'll be reading along in Genesis, get to about chapter 12, then all of a sudden, the book of Job. And you'll read all of that, and then you'll return to Genesis 13. It'll go right back to Genesis then. But I just wanted you to see that. I wanted you to see where the chronology falls in. That's the oldest book in the Bible. And most scholars believe Job himself wrote that, although there are some who believe Moses wrote it. I don't know for sure about that. I would be inclined to say probably Job. But certainly he lived in the time of Abraham. But think about it, all the way up to this time of the Exodus, not one book of the Bible has been written yet. Not one book. Now, Arlene gave me a thing to look at the other day. She got from, I'm almost out of time, but I'm going to see if I can get this out. It had the lineage. We were talking about this briefly the other day, the lineage of all these people. And these are people who lived to be 900 years old at the very beginning. And if you see them all laid out, the ages laid out, a lot of these lives overlapped. And so Shem, who was on Noah's Ark, was still alive in the days of Abraham. That's interesting to me. That's fascinating. So Shem, who was on the ark with Noah, was a contemporary of Abraham. He knew Abraham, or could have known Abraham. And because that's how long their lives were. That's how long they lived, up to 900 years old. And so these stories, you're getting almost firsthand information, these creation stories, because Shem knew Noah, and Noah very likely knew Adam. So you can see how these ages overlap. So if you ever get a chance to access something like it has those ages where they overlap, that's a fascinating thing to look at. And you might want to take a look at one of those, and you can see how all those lives kind of came in overlap with each other. That's just so fascinating to me, but I better hush. I've done gone over time. I'll stop talking.